Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be talking about the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And to do that, we're going to be looking at the Wikipedia entry on the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So, everybody kind of knows, most people know that Rome fell. But is that really the case? Did it really fall? And when people say it fell, what do they even mean? Is it 476 CE? Was that the end? Or is it something that, took centuries?
Yeah, I think, a lot of times when we think about the fall of Rome, we think about this kind of, this big dramatic collapse. But really what we're talking about is something that was a lot more complicated and nuanced. And a lot of historians will even debate whether Rome actually fell or if it just kind of transformed. So there's this concept of late antiquity that some historians will use to talk about this period and to emphasize the sort of continuity between the Roman world and then what came after.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. What does late antiquity mean exactly? And why do some historians prefer to use that term as opposed to the fall?
Yeah, I think the term late antiquity really highlights the idea that this was a long transition. It wasn't just a sudden break. So, from the classical Roman period to the Middle Ages. And it sort of emphasizes that there were elements of Roman society that continued on for centuries afterward.
Yeah.
So it's less about, thinking about this like one specific event and more about this gradual shift in culture and politics and society and even just daily life.
So it's less of a hard stop and more of I don't know, like watching a caterpillar turn into a butterfly. It's still the same creature, but it's undergoing a pretty radical transformation. So, what were some of the key changes then that mark this late antiquity period?
Well, one of the biggest changes is the shift in religious beliefs. So we see Christianity, which starts out as this, kind of persecuted sect. It grows to become the dominant face of the Roman Empire. And this had a huge impact on pretty much everything, on social values, how the empire was governed. I mean, you name it, it's a big one.
Yeah, the rise of Christianity is, for sure a major turning point. But, when most people think about, the fall of Rome, they kind of think about external pressures, right? Like barbarian invasions and stuff. So, how do those kind of fit into the picture?
Well, I think it's important to remember that invasions were definitely a factor, um, but they were part of a much bigger, more complex web of causes, right? So the Roman Empire had always had to deal with migration and conflict on its borders, but in the late 3rd and 4th centuries, that pressure really intensified. So you have groups like the Goths and the Huns, and they're driven by, their own circumstances, of course, but they're pushing against the empire's frontiers, creating instability, stretching resources thin. And that's a big problem for the empire.
Okay, so it's not like just one, massive invasion that brought the whole thing down, right? It's more like a, series of pressures that kind of wore down its strength over time. So this brings up kind of the big question, right? The one that historians have been debating for centuries. Did Rome fall because of these external forces, or were there internal weaknesses that made it vulnerable in the first place?
Yeah, I think that is the question, right? You can kind of think about it like, did the Roman Empire die from a heart attack, or was it just weakened by years of, bad habits? And I think to really understand the fall, you need to look at both, right? Both the external pressures and the internal vulnerabilities.
Okay, so let's dig into those internal factors then. What were some of the cracks, beneath the surface of what seemed to be this really powerful empire?
I think you have to start by thinking about the challenges of managing an empire that was so huge, right? I mean, this is an empire that stretched from Britain all the way to North Africa. So, I mean, just maintaining communication and transportation. And then, you got to think about defense over such a vast territory, even during peacetime. It was a logistical nightmare.
Yeah, that's like trying to manage a giant corporation with offices all over the world. Something's always breaking down somewhere. So were there any specific internal issues that made it really hard for the Romans to respond effectively to, all of these problems?
Well, I think one of the biggest factors was just economic instability. So the Roman economy, it was really heavily reliant on agriculture and trade.
Yeah.
And starting in the 3rd century, it was hit hard by a couple of things. First of all, there were some big climate shifts, so fluctuations in harvests, disease outbreaks, and then on top of all that, rising military costs. So all that put a huge strain on the empire's finances.
So climate change, huh? It's interesting how, that played a role even back then. We think of it as a modern problem, but clearly it had, a ripple effect on Roman society. So how did those economic problems contribute to the empire's decline then?
Think of it this way, when you have economic hardship, It leads to social unrest. People are struggling to make ends meet. And that creates resentment, right, towards the wealthy elite.
Mm.
And all of that makes it harder for the government to collect taxes and then to maintain those essential services, things like infrastructure and defense.
Right. So it's this kind of vicious cycle. Economic problems lead to social problems, which further weaken the government's ability to address the original issues. Were there any other, like, internal factors that played a role in Rome's decline?
Well, the Roman political system, which was, at one point a model of stability, it became increasingly dysfunctional in the late empire. And that's a big deal, right? So you have power struggles between emperors, generals, all these influential families. It led to civil wars. Political assassinations were happening all over the place.
It's like, I don't know, it's like a Roman soap opera,
Mhm.
betrayals and power grabs and backstabbing. So how did all of that instability affect, the empire's ability to just function?
Well, I mean, it created a lot of uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
And it eroded public trust in the leadership. And all of that made it really hard to enact reforms or implement long-term strategies. Even maintaining basic law and order was tough.
So it's not just about, individual emperors being, quote unquote, good or bad, right? It's about the system itself becoming harder to manage, which makes me wonder about the army. Was there, like, an actual decline in military strength, or was it more about the challenges of, like, deploying forces effectively?
That's another good question, and that's something that historians debate quite a bit. So some argue that the Roman army's quality declined, especially as it started to rely more on barbarian recruits. But then others suggest that, the army was still pretty strong. It was more about those logistical challenges that we talked about, and maybe a lack of clear strategic direction from the leadership.
So there's no easy answer there. Were there any attempts to reform the army, or just to address some of these internal challenges?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there were definitely attempts at reform. Some emperors, like Diocletian and Constantine, they tried to make big changes to the administrative structure, the military structure, trying to fix things. But a lot of times, those reforms had unintended consequences, or they just didn't get to the root of the problem.
It's like putting a bandage on a deep wound, right? It stops the bleeding for a little bit, but it's not going to fix the underlying problem. So given all of those challenges, both internal and external, it's kind of amazing that the Western Roman Empire lasted as long as it did.
Yeah, I mean, it really speaks to the resilience, of Roman institutions and also the ingenuity of the Roman people. But even the most, enduring empires have their limits.
That's a sobering thought. So we've kind of established that there wasn't one, single fall of Rome. It was more like this long process of, decline and transformation. What are some of the key events then that kind of mark the turning points in that narrative?
Well, I think a good place to start would be the crisis of the 3rd century. It's this period of intense turmoil. I mean, everything's happening. Civil wars, barbarian invasions, economic collapse.
Yeah.
You even had a devastating plague. And this crisis, it almost destroyed the empire. And even though they managed to pull themselves out of it, Rome was never quite the same.
Yeah, that sounds rough. So how did that crisis, how did it shape, like, the trajectory of the empire? What happened?
Well, it forced the Romans to make some really fundamental changes to their political, economic, and military structures. So you have Diocletian. He emerges from this crisis as emperor. He's the one who implements all those big reforms, things like the Tetrarchy, which divided the empire into those 4 administrative zones, right? He also expanded the army, expanded the bureaucracy. But all of that increased government spending and put a big burden on the population.
So it's like, you're trying to save a sinking ship by adding more weight to it. I don't know if that's a good idea. Did those reforms help, or did they actually hurt the empire in the long run?
Well, it's hard to say for sure. I mean, they did provide a temporary solution, right? It restored order, at least for a while, and it staved off a complete collapse. But it definitely created some new problems, too. The Tetrarchy, which, was designed to share power, it actually ended up leading to more internal conflict. The expanded bureaucracy, the expanded military, that all created a heavier tax burden, right? Which has strained the economy even more.
Yeah, it's like that game, what's that game called? Whack-a-mole. You solve one problem and then another one pops up somewhere else. So the crisis of the 3rd century really kind of sets the stage then for just a whole period of instability and transformation. What are some of the other major events that shaped, those last couple of centuries of the Western Roman Empire? What else happened?
Well, the reign of Constantine the Great is another really big one. a pivotal moment, I would say. He reunites the empire after a period of civil war, but he makes this, this really fateful decision that's going to have huge consequences,
Yeah.
and that is that he embraces Christianity.
Yeah, Constantine's conversion to Christianity, it's one of those things that, changed the course of history. So how did it impact the empire, both in the short term and the long term?
Well, in the short term, it did bring a degree of religious unity to the empire, right? It ended the persecution of Christians, and it granted them official toleration. And that actually allowed Christianity to spread very, very rapidly. I mean, within a few generations, it becomes the dominant faith.
Yeah, that's an amazing transformation. But you said there were some long-term consequences too. So were there downsides to Christianity's success?
Well, it's a complicated question.
Mm.
Uh, some historians argue that Christianity, because it's so focused on, spiritual matters and the afterlife, maybe it shifted attention away from worldly concerns. Maybe it weakened traditional Roman values, and some point to the vast resources that went into building churches and, supporting the clergy. And, those are resources that could have been used for something else.
Right. So it's another one of those double-edged swords. Christianity brings unity and, a kind of spiritual renewal. But it also creates new challenges, and it potentially diverts resources from other things that were important. It seems like, I don't know, every decision, every event, it had all these unintended consequences that just rippled through Roman society.
Yeah, and I think that's the challenge of trying to understand history.
Right.
It's not just about simple cause and effect. There are no easy answers. It's about unraveling this very complex web of, interconnected factors and trying to figure out what they mean.
And that's what makes it so fascinating, right? So I think we've done a good job of laying out the context. We talked about the internal weaknesses, the external pressures, the crisis of the 3rd century, the rise of Christianity. But to really grasp the fall of Rome, we need to get into the specifics, the events, the players, the lasting impact. So I don't know, are you ready to continue this journey through Roman history?
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many fascinating stories and so many insightful lessons to be learned from these final chapters of the Western Roman Empire.
All right, then let's dive in.
Well, we should probably start with Constantine's decision to move the Roman capital to Constantinople in 330 CE. It made sense strategically. It placed the capital closer to the empire's eastern frontiers. And to be honest, those were the richer provinces at that time. But some historians argue that it also kind of symbolized a shift in focus away from the West, and that's a big deal.
So it's like the empire's center of gravity was shifting eastward. Does that have like an immediate impact on the Western Roman Empire? Like what happened?
I mean, it's tough to say for sure, but it definitely created a sense of division, right? And you have the Western Roman Empire still with its capital in Rome. They're facing all these growing challenges, barbarian incursions, economic problems. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, it just seems more stable, more prosperous. It's doing better.
And that growing divide, East and West, it seems like that's going to be a recurring theme here.
Yeah.
So did that division contribute to the fall of the West?
Well, it was probably a factor, yeah. I mean, the Western Roman Empire increasingly had to rely on the East for support, military support, financial support. It created a sense of dependence. And the East is getting stronger, the West is getting weaker. You can see where this is going.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know, like a family business, right? Where one branch is thriving and the other one is struggling. There's going to be resentment, there's going to be competition.
Yeah.
But even with those internal divisions, the Western Roman Empire still had a lot going for it, right? I mean, they had resources, they had manpower. Was there anyone who tried to, hold things together during this period?
Yeah, well, Theodosius I comes to mind. He ruled from 379 to 395 CE. And during his reign, he actually managed to reunify the empire for a short time. He repelled barbarian incursions. He implemented some reforms to try to stabilize the economy. He was, trying to fix things.
Theodosius, a beacon of hope amidst all this chaos. So did his efforts, did they work? Did they lay the groundwork for a lasting recovery?
Well, that's the thing. Unfortunately, not really. You see, just before he died, Theodosius made this fateful decision. He divided the empire between his two sons, Honorius and Arcadius. Honorius, who was just a child at the time, inherited the West, and Arcadius took control of the East. And that division, well, it solidified the split between East and West, and it really set the stage for more instability down the road.
Dividing the empire between two, inexperienced heirs, it sounds like a recipe for disaster. So, what were the immediate consequences of that? What happened?
Well, I mean, it weakened the West significantly. Honorius, he was a kid. He lacked experience. He was surrounded by all these advisors who were fighting for power. It was a mess. And the Western Roman Empire just faced this renewed wave of barbarian invasions, economic problems, political
It
turmoil.
was like like a perfect storm. So was there anyone who emerged, to try to provide some leadership, try to stabilize things during this time? Anyone step up?
Well, there's this one guy, Stilicho, powerful general, actually, of Vandal origin. And he served as Honorius's chief advisor and military commander. Stilicho was really good at what he did. He was a skilled strategist. He was a great tactician. And for a time, he actually managed to hold back the tide of those barbarian invasions. I mean, he even defeated Alaric and the Visigoths at the Battle of Plentia in 402 CE.
Wow. So Stilicho, he's like, holding back the chaos. He's like a bulwark.
So those victories, did they buy the empire some time?
They did, yeah, they did. But his success also kind of made him a target. Some Romans, they didn't trust him because he was barbarian. Others were just jealous of his power and influence. And then there's the fact that he relied on barbarian troops to beef up the Roman army. And that made a lot of people uneasy.
Yeah, I can see that. It's like a classic dilemma, right? You rely on outsiders to help defend you, and it creates all this new tension, all these new risks. So what happened to Stilicho? What brought him down? Well, in 408 CE, he got caught up in some court intrigue. Rumors started spreading that he was plotting to overthrow Honorius, that he wanted to put his own son on the throne. We don't know if those rumors are true or not, but they created this atmosphere of paranoia and fear.
Court intrigue, paranoia. Sounds like a Shakespearean tragedy, but set in ancient Rome. So what happened next?
Well, Honorius, he was convinced that Stilicho was a traitor, so he ordered his execution. And it wasn't just him. Stilicho's loyal troops, they were massacred. His family was put to death.
Wow, that's brutal. A brutal end for a guy who had dedicated his life to defending the empire. So what were the consequences? What happened after Stilicho was gone?
Well, it left a huge power vacuum in the Western Roman Empire. And without his leadership, without his military skills, well, the empire was just wide open. And just 2 years later, in 410 CE, Alaric and the Visigoths, they marched on Rome and sacked the city.
The sack of Rome. 410 CE. It's one of those events that, just sends chills down your spine, right? The eternal city, the heart of the empire, plundered by barbarians. It's hard to even imagine. So what was the impact of that?
It sent shockwaves through the empire.
Yeah.
I mean, even beyond the empire. It was a symbolic blow. It showed everyone that Rome was vulnerable. It showed everyone that the Western Roman Empire was in decline. And it created this sense of panic, this sense of despair among the Roman people. They're starting to wonder, is this the end? Is our civilization crumbling?
Yeah. That's heavy stuff. I can't imagine, just the psychological impact of something like that. So did the Western Roman Empire, did they ever recover from that?
They never fully recovered, no.
Yeah.
They did rebuild Rome, and the empire, it continued on for a few more decades. But the sack of Rome, 410, it was a turning point. It was like this wound that never really healed.
So even though they limped on for a while, you're saying that this was like the beginning of the end. So what happened in the aftermath? Did they try to, did they try to regain control? Or at least, stabilize the situation?
There were attempts to, restore order, defend the territories they still held. But the Western Roman Empire, they just couldn't catch a break. They faced this endless wave of challenges. Barbarian groups kept pushing, carving out their own kingdoms, challenging Roman authority at every turn.
It's like, like the dam broke and there was no way to stop the flood.
Yeah.
So were there any other key players, any key events that, shaped this final phase of decline? What else happened?
Well, you can't talk about this period without talking about Attila the Hun. He united the Hunnic tribes under his banner, and he just unleashed this reign of terror across Europe. He extracted tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire, and he even threatened to conquer the West. He was a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah, Attila the Hun. His name is, it's synonymous with brutality and destruction. So what kind of impact did he have on the Western Roman Empire? Which was already weakened, right?
His incursions into Gaul, his incursions into Italy, they just created more instability, more panic. And even though he never actually sacked Rome, his campaigns, they diverted resources and manpower away from other threats.
So the Western Roman Empire, they're getting squeezed from all sides. It's a tough situation. But even in the middle of all this chaos, it sounds like there were still people who were trying to hold things together. What about Aetius, the last of the Romans? What's his story?
Flavius Aetius. He was a brilliant general. a master of politics. He rose to prominence in the 430s, and for almost 20 years, he was basically the de facto ruler of the Western Roman Empire. He was directing military campaigns, negotiating with barbarian leaders, just trying to keep things from falling apart.
He sounds like a guy who's, trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. What was some of his big successes, and what were the challenges he faced? Tell me more.
Well, he had some pretty significant victories. The most famous one is probably the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 CE. That's where he led this coalition of Roman and Visigothic forces against Attila the Hun.
Wow, that's the one, right? The one that's often portrayed as this clash of civilizations, this desperate stand against the barbarian hordes. What was at stake there? How did it all go down?
I mean, everything was at stake. I mean, Attila's Huns, they'd been tearing through Gaul. And if they weren't stopped, it would have been devastating. At Aetius, he knew he couldn't do it alone, so he formed this alliance with the Visigothic king, Theodoric I.
So it's a case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Right.
Did it work?
Well, it was a bloody battle, lots of casualties on both sides. And in the end, it was more of a stalemate than a decisive victory. But it did stop Attila's advance. They didn't go any further to Roman territory.
A pivotal moment. But even with that victory, the empire was still, in a precarious position. What challenges did Aetius face after the battle?
He had a lot on his plate. Barbarian incursions were still happening. There was political instability in Rome. Resources were dwindling. And on top of all that, he had made some enemies, especially among the Roman elite. They didn't like his power. They didn't like his influence.
The talented outsider who saves the day but gets stabbed in the back. It's a classic story, unfortunately. So what happened to Aetius?
Well, in 454 CE, he was assassinated. On the orders of Emperor Valentinian III, no less. The emperor had been convinced by, some jealous courtiers that Aetius was a threat to his power.
Treachery, short-sightedness. It seems like the Western Roman Empire just couldn't, they couldn't catch a break. So what happened after Aetius was gone?
Well, that was pretty much it. The last strong leader who could hold back the chaos was gone. The Western Roman Empire just spiraled downward. Puppet emperors were being installed and deposed. Powerful generals, barbarian warlords, they were calling the shots. And then, in 476 CE, Odoacer, a Germanic general, deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus.
Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor. Wow. Okay, so what happened? Was it a big dramatic showdown, a last stand?
No, not really. I mean, Romulus Augustulus, he was just a kid, really, a teenager. He was just a pawn in this bigger game. Odoacer, after he deposed him, he sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople. He was basically acknowledging the Eastern Roman emperor as the sole ruler. It was over.
So the Western Roman Empire just kind of, I don't know, just faded away. The last emperor, just a footnote in history. It's a surprisingly quiet end for such a powerful civilization.
I think it reminds us that these big historical turning points, they're not always about single events, right?
Yeah.
They're more about these long-term processes that lead up to them. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, it wasn't this, this sudden collapse. It was a gradual decline. It was death by 1,000 cuts, internal weaknesses, external pressures, and all these events that just chipped away at the foundation.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the empire at its peak to its final demise. But even though the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist, it didn't just vanish, right? It left a legacy. So what are some of the lasting impacts of Roman civilization? What did they leave behind?
That's a great question, and it leads us into the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've been talking about the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but, it's not really about the fall, is it? It's about the transformation. So what parts of, Roman civilization, what survived, what carried on, and how did it shape the world that came after?
Well, I think that's the key takeaway here, right? The fall of the Western Roman Empire wasn't the end of Roman influence. It was, in a lot of ways, a new beginning.
It's kind of like scattering seeds, right? The original plant might die off, but those seeds, they can take root. They can sprout new life in unexpected places. So what seeds did Rome leave behind, and where did they end up?
Well, I mean, one of the most obvious and enduring legacies is language. Latin, the language of the Roman Empire, it evolved into all these Romance languages that we know today.
Okay.
French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, the list goes on.
It's amazing to think that the words we use today, that you have these echoes of ancient Rome. That's a powerful connection to the past. What else? What other parts of Roman civilization were really influential?
Roman law is another big one.
Yeah.
They had this incredibly sophisticated legal system, and it emphasized a lot of things that we still value today. Codified laws, due process, the idea that justice should be universal.
Hmm.
And those ideas, they had a huge impact on the development of legal systems all over the world.
So the empire might be gone, but the legal principles, they're still with us. It's a reminder that ideas can outlast empires. What about some of the more, tangible things? Like, did the Romans leave behind anything, anything we can see?
Oh, absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, Roman engineering, Roman architecture, it left an incredible mark on the world. I mean, think about it. Roman roads, aqueducts, bridges, all those public buildings, those structures weren't just practical, they were a statement. They showed off Roman power, Roman ingenuity.
Yeah, those arches, the Colosseum, those roads that, just went on forever, straight as an arrow. It's like they're still speaking to us. What impact did those structures have on later societies?
Well, they were the models, right? Future builders, future engineers, they looked to those Roman structures for inspiration. The techniques, the principles that were studied, they were adapted. I mean, Roman construction methods influenced everything. Medieval castles, churches, even Renaissance palaces.
It's like this thread that connects ancient Rome to the modern world. It's incredible.
Yeah.
Are there any other ways that, maybe are a little less obvious where Roman civilization had an impact?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, art, literature, philosophy, you name it.
Mhm.
Roman sculpture, painting, mosaics, all of that influenced artistic styles for centuries. Roman writers, people like Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, they inspired artists and poets and playwrights for generations.
So it wasn't just about conquest and military power. They had a rich culture. What about their political system? Did that have any lasting influence?
Even though the Roman Republic, eventually gave way to the empire, those ideals of representative government, the rule of law, civic virtue, those things didn't just disappear. They influenced political thought in the West. And they contributed, in a way to the development of constitutional republics and democratic ideals that we value today.
It's fascinating to think that even though the Roman Empire itself is gone, its political legacy, it's still shaping the world. It's remarkable how such a vast and complex empire could have such a lasting impact.
Yeah, it really is. It speaks to the power of ideas, innovation, and cultural exchange.
Hmm.
The Roman Empire might be a thing of the past, but its legacy is all around us.
I think that's a great place to wrap things up. This deep dive into the fall of the Western Roman Empire, it's been an amazing journey. It's not just about, you know, the fall, right? It's about understanding the impact, the lasting influence. It's about recognizing those echoes of the past in the present.
And hopefully it'll inspire people to learn more.
Yeah.
There's so much to discover about ancient Rome, about its legacy, about its relevance to our world today.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning.
Tell us what you think about this episode. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.